So, welcome back to the Zone Blitz Draft Report. Again, I'm Eric Sandlin. Today, I am joined by Mark Bernier and Tony Dow. And what we're looking to do today is to dig a little deeper into what I was talking about the last time around and the validity behind the things that are done at the combine. And do they make sense anymore? Could they be done better? And I brought Mark and Tony in due to their backgrounds and the perspectives that they can bring. So why don't we start with a brief introduction in that regards. Mark, a little bit about yourself.
An exercise physiologist from UMass Amherst. I've been a personal trainer for athletes for almost 2 decades. I'm currently a high school anatomy teacher and have been doing that for 18 years.
I played football for 2 years in the Army. I was part of the now defunct Texoma Military League. I played running back, fullback, special teams. I returned kicks. I covered punts, kickoffs, things like that.
So for the most part, what we're going to be talking about, given the backgrounds involved here, is really the physical aspect, the physical drills that take place in the combine, what they're supposed to measure, whether or not they're accurate measures of those targets. We will get into at the tail end, we'll get into the intellectual side of things too, because of course there's also an IQ test that is administered at the combine. So just to get rolling, basically when the combine runs through these drills, there is about 7 that they will put these athletes through. There's your 40-yard dash, your 225-pound bench, your vertical leap, broad jump, 3-cone drill, short shuttle, and long shuttle. And the inspiration that I had behind doing this interview the first time around, years ago with Mark actually, was this book. And I don't know if this is going to show up very well on the camera, but it is The Draft by Pete Williams. Now, this was published back in 2006. It was covering the events that took place during the 2005 draft. So it is a tad out of date, but Williams does a great job of breaking down the events in the combine. So, for example, the 40-yard dash, you start from 3-point stance, sprint 40 yards, you're clocked in increments of 10 and 20 and 40 yards. Little piece of trivia, the reason why it's 40 yards actually is from Hall of Fame coach Paul Brown, who figured 40 yards is about how long you're running to get to cover a punt. Mm-hmm. So there's some benchmark there that makes some sense. It's designed to test pure speed, basically, along with, according to Williams, along with power and explosion. So from that aspect, we'll start with the 40-yard dash. Valid, not valid? Is there a better way to try to get these measurements, or?
Well, I guess the first thing that I would address when it comes to what I've seen in the combine, that does not need to be done this way anymore. But for the most part, I see coaches with stopwatches, and we're talking about measures that are now being compared in the tenths of a second. But a person's visual reflexes can be off upwards of a second.
Sure.
So when somebody's crossing a line, you have a very subjective measure of when you're going to push the button, and then up to a second before the button actually gets pushed.
Yep.
So you may have coaches who, in anticipation of this, knowing full well they do this, may push the button too early, trying to mitigate that. Others are pushing it too late, distractions. That form of measurement is so inaccurate that right off the bat, I think that a lot of these numbers are really not very valid. Numerically, now, when you're collecting data, you've got your quantitative data, so you're just your straight numbers, and then you have a qualitative thing, which is things that are measured without numbers.
Okay.
Qualities are descriptors that can't be quantified or calculated. So I think, in my opinion, today, you're probably seeing a lot of coaches with stopwatches as a matter of course, because it would almost be silly to watch somebody sprint without one.
Right.
But I think most coaches probably know what they're looking for and know full well that particular 40-yard dash, or maybe if they do 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever.
Typically, I believe each prospect is to run twice. Yeah.
So, that's a very quick snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
So that being put out there on the table, that the numbers themselves are probably not particularly valid. My secondary assessment of the way this is done is that for the most part on a football field, and I think I'm probably going to address this over and over again when we look at these measures, is that people don't pick a point and run in a straight line 40 yards for a point and stop.
Right.
They are constantly making adjustments to the direction. So you're looking at not only straight line speed, but you're looking at their ability to make mental adjustments on the fly, and then for their body to follow that.
Okay.
I would like to see, if I were to redesign these, if anybody would ask me to do this, I think what I would like to see is a floating target.
Okay.
That is like a randomized target that's coming at you.
Mm-hmm.
If this really is based on the idea of covering a punt return or covering a kickoff,
Okay.
then what I would like to see is a floating target. Something that maybe it's almost like a remote control. It's run, and you're aiming for that target, and you're going to try to approach it as close as you can get to it.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Over a 40-yard period.
Okay.
And then I would look at two things. How fast did you traverse that time? And because we have bird's eye cameras, you can actually videotape this entire thing and watch how quickly the person makes the adjustment.
Okay.
When that robot, for lack of a better term,
Sure.
that's moving toward you changes its direction, how long did it take you to change your direction?
Right.
And then finally, at the end of the 40 seconds, when the whistle is blown and you stop running, how close were you to your target?
Okay. Now, I guess, I could play a little bit of devil's advocate in some ways, in the sense that there are other drills that we'll touch on here momentarily that are designed to test change of direction ability and agility. Whereas what they're looking for out of the 40-yard dash pretty much really is just speed.
Straight lines.
Mm-hmm. The idea of power and explosion, that's more along the lines of what they call the 10-yard split and the 20-yard split. So in that case, they're measuring acceleration.
Correct.
Okay. Now, one thing that's really interesting, though, that I just thought of while you were talking about that idea, and I think you'll be able to address this better, Tony, having had punt coverage experience.
Sure.
My understanding is the way a punt coverage team is designed is not so much that you are actually truly running towards the ball carrier, as it is that you have a lane that you are responsible for maintaining.
Exactly.
And so that really you should be running pretty much just in a straight line and not make an adjustment to the ball carrier unless the ball carrier comes into your lane.
You make adjustments to your defender.
If you leave your lane, you open up a hole that a punt returner will see in a heartbeat, and he will run right through it.
Mm-hmm.
Punt returners love that. They love it when the coverage team gets over aggressive and somebody tries to charge him down, because he knows all he has to do is make one little wiggle and he can get loose.
Right. So you are still really, ultimately, in that circumstance, you're probably running in a straight line,
exactly.
more or less.
The goal really is to all get there at the same time and close in on it. That's basically how that works. When I look at the 40, what I really see is a drill that tells me if it's a running back I'm looking at and he's got a good 40 time, that tells me he's got home run potential.
Okay. Yep.
If it's a receiver and he's got a great 40 time, I know that he's a guy who can get behind the corner and pull the safety.
Right.
And get open deep, and then maybe open up the middle of the field too.
Sure.
That's what I really look at. Is it's like a bonus for those positions.
Sure.
If those guys have great straight line speed, it's
Yeah.
not really necessarily a necessity. It's not something I have to look for.
Mm-hmm.
But if he's got it, he might move up the list a little bit.
Right. And typically when you see a great 40-yard dash time out of an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman, that doesn't necessarily mean all that much in the aspect of the game and the position that they play, because obviously they're not going to run that far. If they are, it's because a play's gone really, really badly. But it's a good measure of their athleticism anyway. When you've got somebody, there was a player at this year's draft, this year's combine, and now I'm going to draw a blank on his name, small school prospect, offensive lineman, who ran, like a 4.7 or 4.8 40. Some teams are actually thinking about trying to make this kid a tight end. Mm-hmm. He's 6'6" and 310 pounds. And they're thinking about, can we turn this kid into Rob Gronkowski? that's just a measure of, wow, this kid's a really good athlete to be able to move that well for his size.
Well, running backs love offensive linemen who can run like that too.
Well, sure, yeah. If I've got a blocker who can stay with me,
if I'm 15 yards down the field and I look up and I've got an offensive tackle in front of me, I'm having a good day.
Yeah, absolutely. Something else that you mentioned too, in regards to the sort of the arbitrariness, I guess, of the stopwatch. Subjectiveness. Thank you. All these coaches and all these scouts and all these GMs and even team owners nowadays show up to the combine, and they often do have their own stopwatch in their hand. And so you will hear all the time about this guy was clocked unofficially at this time, unofficially at that time. Because, yeah, all these coaches are going to come up with a whole variation of times. There is technically an official who has his own, I have to assume, stopwatch. And he's marking the official combine time. But I think when we've had this kind of conversation in the past, you also talked about the idea of why not just eliminate the stopwatch from the proceedings entirely? Why not just... The way the combine works right now is they start the clock as soon as the prospect starts to move. So it's not even that a gun goes off. It's that once the prospect says, okay, I'm going, he goes, everybody clicks their watch to start. And then they click it again when they stop. I think we had a conversation in the past of the idea of, first of all, it shouldn't be the prospect who starts it. It should be a gun. It should be simulating a snap count. And that to mark the actual end of the dash, it should be almost like a motion detector at a store.
Yeah,
you know, once you pass through the laser beam. Yeah. And so I guess we would agree that would be a more consistent and accurate measure.
There's no reason not to. I mean, we have a half dozen of those things in high school.
Right.
You know, that can measure that stuff down to the hundredth of a second. Mm-hmm. So if numbers are really that important to the teams, there are much better ways to gather the numeric data.
Right. Okay. So before we move on to the other drills, as long as we're talking about speed, actually, I want to go off onto some of the ways that they try to coach these prospects for the combine. So it's become a huge business now to help these prospects prep for the combine and get them bigger, get them stronger. Agents are paying thousands of dollars to these businesses for their clients to be able to go and train. And so some of the training techniques that were mentioned in this book that I just wanted to get, again, an opinion on, we talked about a little bit earlier today while we were having lunch, plyometrics, the idea of plyometrics. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Plyometrics is a set of exercises. It's an approach to training that maximizes what I consider maximizing functional power. Plyometrics has been around for quite a long time, used in different ways by different athletes. Sprinters and Olympians who are doing that kind of event have been using forms of plyometrics, even if they weren't called that, for decades, probably longer. What a plyometric is it requires two things, usually an explosive force, which is really what you're saying when you say power, force over time. And the second thing they're looking at in most plyometric exercises is quick changes of direction, which is one of the number one cause of injury in any athletic endeavor. It is not a straight line movement or even the initial acceleration, for example, out of the blocks for a sprinter. It's really when you have to change direction quickly.
We see it all the time when the collateral ligaments get blown. And an NFL player, he
wasn't touched.
Right. He tried to go one way, the turf grabbed his shoe or whatever it was. He tried to go one way, his body didn't want to follow, and at the knee pull.
Yeah, the ACL or the MCL pops. So in training for those kinds of changes in direction, you actually, one, prevent injury, and two, you are focusing on a certain set or subset of the individual muscles. So muscles are not one large chunk of red meat. Right? Muscles are actually divvied up into smaller bundles called fascicles, and those are divvied up into what we call motor units. And really, when athletics comes right down to it, it's all about motor unit training. A motor unit is one nerve and all the cells or all the muscle fibers that it controls. each fiber is controlled by one nerve, but one nerve can control as few as 3 or so fibers for very dexterous movements like at the eyeball, all the way upwards of hundreds of fibers in the thigh.
Okay.
When you have hundreds of fibers, you're not looking at dexterous movement, you're looking at strength.
Okay.
When you have very small motor unit ratios, you're looking at dexterity or agility. When a person first starts training, their strength and speed increase drastically in the first 6 weeks, not due to any physiological changes in the muscle structure, but in neurological changes in how those motor units are recruited. These are called recruitment patterns. I think the best analogy that any of your audience might be able to connect with is the idea of shooting a free throw. Okay. When a person first gets up to shoot a free throw, usually you've got two options: you brick it off the backboard, or you miss entirely, right?
Oh no, that one would be me. Never mind. Okay.
So you end up very short, or bricking it off the backboard, and then with practice, you get closer and closer and closer to the swish that we're all looking for.
Right.
And that is your body learning to recruit these specific motor units in the correct order to produce the exact amount of force necessary to complete that action. Quarterbacks are amazing at this because what their bodies have done through years of practice and some inborn innate talent is to be able to calculate very, very quickly how far they need to throw the ball at what angle to get beyond the defender and hit the receiver at the angle and speed they're running, whether it's a timing route or not. They've got to do all of that in the three-step drop.
Yeah. Is this muscle memory, basically? Is this what people are referring to when they say muscle memory? Okay.
So in the old days, you weren't allowed to weight train off season because they knew when people did a lot of this, when they came back, all that was thrown off. Okay. And we've probably, as kids, all done this. You play basketball for your youth organization. You go away for 6 months and you're just growing. You might not even be lifting weights. And then you come back and you're overshooting everything because you're stronger. So today in athletics, it's actually not expected that you won't train off season, that you're training all around, all year round. And that is what we call both cross training and specified training. So now when I go lift weights, the next day I go shoot my free throws. So as my muscles are getting stronger, my brain is learning to retrain, turn off motor units I no longer need, turn on new motor units that better do the job. It's also what makes your athletes efficient. They use the least amount of motor units to complete the work, and therefore the least amount of oxygen to complete the work. So they're fresher. Everything we do in athletics comes down to these recruitment patterns. Plyometrics. So I haven't lost track of our question, but it's hard to answer a question about plyometrics without the general understanding of what motor unit recruitment is. Plyometrics is designed specifically to recruit those motor units in the correct patterns to get the result you're looking for, depending on whether you're high jumping, you're coming out of the blocks as a sprinter, you're changing directions laterally, let's say as a running back trying to hit a hole. And experts in plyometrics, which I am not, will design these. There are certainly basic exercises, but we'll also design exercises that are specific to the athletic endeavor.
I think the book here is probably referring to, because again, we're talking about the beginnings of this industry to prep players just to go to the combine. So you're training them just to be able to run really fast or jump really high or whatever. So we're not talking about anything sport specific or position specific. But he mentions, for example, so the first time that it's mentioned in this book, it's mentioned in reference to a guy by the name of Mike Boyle, who was a strength and conditioning coach at Boston University, then went on to become a strength and conditioning coach for the Boston Bruins. I don't know what he's doing now, but he's referenced here about pulling out a magazine called Bigger, Faster, Stronger and turning to an article on plyometrics and handing it to an agent who was sitting here wondering, why should I bring my clients to you to be trained? Explaining it as a new regimen of jumps to make an athlete more explosive and powerful. This agent's witnessing, these prospects jumping up and down on platforms and on boxes and trying to run with a harness around his waist, and Boyle on the other end holding onto a rubber tube to provide resistance. So it's that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's become that popular. You even see it in commercials now, the Gatorade commercials and such, where you see guys,
Okay, sure. Towing a sled behind him? Is that kind of the same idea?
Sled, doing things like
parachutes too.
Right, the parachutes behind it.
Those are all providing resistance during the actual exercise. In the United States, we moved away from functional exercise, and I really think a lot of that came from, no disrespect to him, but from Arnold Schwarzenegger and his buddies. When bodybuilding became particularly popular, the way to look like that is to do isolation exercises. So you try to isolate one or two muscles at a time, you work them to their utmost, and then you move on to a new body part. You're sculpting, toning. They do get very, very powerful, very strong, but not in a functional way.
Okay.
So, for example, in the Soviet states, whichever Russian state, well, the Soviet states now, of course, broken up, they still do this, the kettlebell. I'm sure all of the knowledgeable people in your audience who have heard of kettlebell workouts have been around for 150 or more years.
Okay.
And that is exactly what they're built for, is to make you move through full body movements that require your legs, your lower back, your core, your arms, your shoulders, all in one move. Okay. Because we tend not to. One of the reasons, and maybe this is the time to segue, that I completely disagree with the bench press.
Sure.
As a test. A bench press, not only does it not measure much that is functional in football, it doesn't even measure much that's functional in your chest.
Right.
Because that's not the primary movement of those muscles.
Sure. Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. Tony, is there anything that you want to add in? I don't know if when you were training, when you were in the weight room for the football team, or maybe even just in the military in general, was plyometrics something that got applied at that time, or was it a...
We were a little bit unique in that, because we were a military league, we mostly did our physical conditioning, at our morning PT. We were all in great shape.
Which is mostly calisthenics, or
a lot of calisthenics. Running. Some push-ups. We would do a 6-mile run every Sunday, things like that. So when we were playing football, we were mostly looking more at the X's and O's and football specific.
The conditioning came from the military.
Conditioning came from the military lifestyle.
Okay. So we can take a look. I want to go back about a couple things about speed when the opportunity presents itself. But if we do want to do the segue to the bench press, so a player lies on a bench, he presses 225 pounds off his chest as many times as possible. According to the book, the drill tests nothing more specific than overall strength, but a lot of scouts believe a poor performance on the bench shows a lack of dedication to the weight room and a lack of dedication to conditioning.
I can see that.
Now, later in the book, Boyle talks about his opinion of the bench press. He also does not have a high opinion of it at all. He basically says it's really more a test of endurance than it is strength. If they really want to test brute strength, they should have these prospects trying to bench their own body weight or something heavier than 225. Boyle uses 275 as an example. So,
well, I mean, my idea for how to measure strength, the way that they're looking for, is almost like a horse pull. Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen a horse pull like at a county fair where they have a sled full of cinder blocks and you see how quickly the horses can drag it X distance?
Or even some of these, if you look at ESPN2 or whatever in the world's strongest man competitions and the guy's towing a bus behind him or whatever,
or something. Yeah, something like that. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything that ridiculous.
Sure.
But, have a heavy weight on a track, on an incline, and see how far they can push it up.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Boyle was on the forefront of a lot of this. I met Boyle many years ago.
Yep.
When the idea of plyometrics and more functional testing was coming around, and I agree with him on many points. In this one, I deviate from him slightly in that I don't even think it's a great test of endurance.
Okay.
Muscles are, or I should say, activities are muscle specific. So we're made up of red muscle, white muscle, and gray muscle, we'll call it. And not to get too technical, but the gray muscle makes up approximately 10% of our overall muscle mass. And it will switch to become more white in nature or more red in nature, depending on what you do. Red muscle is high endurance muscle. White muscle has low endurance and is quick and powerful.
Okay.
So humans in general are about 70-30.
Okay. Is there sorry to interrupt, but is there a blend of these different muscles within each muscle group, or is it more along the lines of like your biceps are primarily red or white, your thighs are primarily red or white, or is every muscle group kind of a blend?
All the muscles are a blend of all the fibers, including the motor units. So one motor unit isn't all red or all white or all gray. So if you were to do a cross section and look at the muscle under a microscope, you'd see red, white, and gray all nestled together.
Okay.
Again, an analogy that I think people could follow is the reason Purdue doesn't let their chickens run around is that chickens are mostly white meat. And the more weight they have to carry and the more you allow them to run around, the more endurance they build. And that becomes dark meat. So dark meat is more red.
Okay.
If you take a look at a duck's breast meat, it's very, very dark because they fly 1,000 miles.
Right.
So really, really terrific endurance. It's tough. It's slow, comparatively slow. But it stores an enormous amount of oxygen and protein. White meat, on the other hand, is what you would see in a frog.
Okay.
Frogs are not known for going south of the winter, right? They do really short bursts of energy, very, very fast, very quickly. So we're built of both.
Okay.
And so what can happen is if you have an athlete that does a lot of running, their legs will become more red.
Okay.
And then if they go to the weight room and they do upper body exercises, their upper body muscles can become more white. So each muscle responds to the activity that you use to train. So in this case, when you're talking about a bench press, you can train for a bench press to build muscular endurance in your chest and triceps, which, as far as I understand, the average length of a play in football is about 4 seconds that the ball is in play from.
Yeah, could be. Yeah,
right. And so anything beyond 4 seconds, the endurance is wasted.
Right.
The only people who need to worry about that are the occasional times when a running back or a receiver breaks away and runs the full length of the field. And even in that, with their great speed, we're not talking endurance. I mean, most of them can make one end of the field to the other in what?
Probably. Well,
10, 12 seconds, 15 seconds.
If you're going goal line to goal line, you might be talking 10, 12 seconds. Unless you've got, a defensive lineman who's probably tripping and falling over himself by the time he gets to the 20-yard line. Please, somebody take the ball.
I'm thinking of
that being
Dan Connolly's 71-yard kick return.
Right.
Years back.
So that being said, you never see any of these athletes really move into an energy system that requires any surge of endurance muscle. Okay. You're always looking at these short-term muscle bursts. The bench press, therefore, doing 225 pounds as many times as possible is an absolute waste. Secondly, when does an athlete in football ever push off with their arms? In fact,
well, the only thing I can think of,
blockers.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is blocking. Okay. Primarily, I would have to assume like offensive linemen, especially doing pass blocking. The idea, pardon me, and this has gotten to be a bigger and bigger thing now. When they bring these prospects into the Senior Bowl, they bring them into the combine and they measure them. Not only are they measuring height and weight, but now they'll measure the length of their hands. Like if you've got small hands, that's not
arms.
Right. Yeah. If you've got small hands, it's not good if you're a wide receiver or a quarterback. They want to know that you've got ball security, your hand can get around the ball. Arm length has become a huge thing, particularly with offensive linemen and particularly with offensive tackles, with the idea of pass protection, in that if you can get extension and keep your defender off you, there's going to be, he's coming at you, you're coming at him when the ball snaps. So there's going to be they look for that, what they call that hand punch. He comes at you and you jar him, and then you latch onto him.
Sure.
That's not holding. Holding's not unless you're outside the shoulders. If you're inside,
it's holding, but it's not holding.
It's holding on every play, but it doesn't get called on every play. But anyway, if you're technically speaking, if you're inside the shoulders, you can grab hold and it's legal. But you want to be able to keep your arms locked out, keep your defender off you, and now you can control him and walk him wherever you want him to go.
Now there's the thing. So that's where you deviated from the usefulness of the bench press.
Okay. Isn't that a bench press kind of movement?
It is once. But that bench press, if you want to see how hard he can hit someone, to jar him, like you said. And if I were to do that, I guess I'd go a little lower and try to knock the wind out of him. So I'm going to hit him. I'm going to hit him in the solar plexus.
That I think might be illegal, but anyway.
But what I'm going to say is that you look at the people who are known and shown across the board to hit the hardest are martial artists.
Sure.
Right? And that type of snap, that idea of a quick hopping movement, they are masters at, and they are not great bench pressers. Right? That is, again, motor recruitment. It's learning how to recruit the right amount of muscles in the shortest amount of time. That's what power is all about. that bench press, if you were to try to use a bench press to measure that, you would want a guy, and we discussed this earlier, kind of the laughter around the table.
Okay.
You would want to see how far a person can throw the 225-pound bar off of their chest, because that would be a true measure.
How quickly they can roll to get out of the way.
And then you got to get out of the way.
Right.
But a true measure of power then would be to set the bar on your chest and toss it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they continue to do it over and over and over again, getting slower and slower and slower as their strength wanes until they just can't lift it anymore. Secondly, the bench press isn't even the best measure of chest strength, because that's not the direction that the chest wants to push it. The chest actually wants to push down at an angle, not straight forward.
Okay.
Third, really the most important thing is what you got to, is that when you latch on to your opponent, do they continue to push straight into you, or do they try to move around you?
No, I'm sure they're using, swim moves and rip moves and all that kind of stuff.
Right. So none of that is chest. Now
Every
you're
once
talking
in a while,
about
you
forward.
get a guy who will try to just power
do a
right
bull rush.
over you.
And that being the case, what you're now talking about is core strength. You're talking about strength in the abdominal muscles, the leg muscles. What I was going to say is, if you have an incredibly powerful chest, there's nothing behind you. You're not setting your back against a bench or a wall and then pushing the man away.
Right.
The thing that stabilizes your body is legs.
Mm-hmm.
So if your legs are weak and your chest is strong, you're just going to push yourself over like a weeble wall.
Okay.
Right? So really the more important thing is, and I think Tony would verify this, is that if you are going to pop somebody in the chest, you have to have your weight forward.
Oh, for sure.
And you're pushing with your legs, and then that's a full body move. And if the timing isn't there, you're not going to be effective.
Right.
The idea is to lean into it without overcommitting, because if the defender sees you overcommitting, then he's gonna faint and spin away.
Right. Sure. You're going to fall on your face.
Exactly.
I was just about to get that.
So let's talk about this. We're looking at the theory side of it from Mark's perspective and his background. But you were in addition to being on special teams, you said you were a fullback, which is primarily a blocking position. Mm-hmm. So if you were looking for some way, then you're a coach or a talent or a scout. You're looking for some way in a athletic drill context to measure whether or not prospect X has the kind of strength and power that you want out of him as a blocker. Mm-hmm. What could you envision as a drill that might do it? I mean, there's that idea of pushing a big block or big weight up an incline.
Or a blocking sled. See how long it takes him to push a blocking sled 10 meters.
Right. Okay.
That general idea. I mean, you could do. I suppose you could do something like Mark said. You could be tossing a medicine ball.
Right.
Okay. If I were to design something, I would probably look at a heavy bag. Okay. And I would hang it from 2 chains, so it swung in one direction rather than spinning around.
Right. Yeah.
And I would have them pop that bag, and then have a camera and measure how far up it swings in its pendulum motion. That's a very easy calculation and tells you how much power was generated to move it.
Or what about? I'm having a flashback now to Rocky IV and watching Ivan Drago, punch into a plate, and the plate measures in foot-pounds, I guess it is, the force that was applied.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't measure it, the NFL might. We wouldn't measure it in foot-pounds anymore. We'd measure it in newtons. But so it's the same type of thing. Yeah. And that works great because Drago is punching Rocky in the head, so they're measuring a punch. Right. But again, in football, you're not punching somebody. This is a much more complicated movement than a punch in some respects. Okay. It's a much less specific movement than a punch in other respects, because it requires all kinds of variations depending on the height and weight of your opponent. Right. And their leg position and where you meet them as these two titans come together. Right. Where your foot happens to be placed. I mean, foot placement's got to be of ultimate importance.
Foot placement, balance. They talk a lot about how they want offensive linemen. I'll see this all the time when I read scouting reports in the various magazines that are out there. They talk about they want to see an offensive lineman who bends at his knees, not at his waist. Mm-hmm. Keep your back straight. If you're going to bend to get your leverage, bend at the knees. Mm-hmm.
It keeps your center of balance.
Well, this too is, I think, another area where we may be overcomplicating this. Mm-hmm. If we want to know how strong a guy is as far as blocking goes, let's bring in an NFL practice squad linebacker defensive end and have him block the guy.
Well, but see, and here's where, and now you can just talk about maybe the overall validity of the combine as an event, period. Because obviously, these scouts and these coaches, they've seen the game film.
Right.
They can tell whether or not a player is capable of playing the game.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think the drills might come in is when you're looking at, you're looking at some prospect who plays for the University of New Hampshire or UMaine or Cal Polytech or whatever, and he's a beast when he's playing against that level of competition.
Right.
But that's not the Pac-10, that's not the SEC, and it's certainly not the NFL.
Right.
So what can we use? Game film isn't necessarily as relevant now for this guy. What can we use that maybe gives us a better baseline to measure him against the kids from the SEC and the Pac-10? And I think maybe that's where the combine comes in. And then it's just a matter of do the drills from the combine, do what they say the drills are supposed to do, or is there a better way to go about doing it?
Well, I was again, I would really like to see some actual man-on-man type drills. One of the things that I hear NFL coaches say over and over again is that they love to see these guys in the Senior Bowl and the East West Shrine Game and things like that, because it's their first chance to see these guys matched up against other NFL caliber players.
Yep.
Well, why not do some 7-on-7 drills at the combine? Because not everybody gets to go to these games. A lot of these lower round draft picks
they don't get invited.
Don't get invited to these games. You can do some 7-on-7 drills at the combine and put all of these guys up against other NFL caliber talent. See how they perform.
No, absolutely.
My caution against bringing in a practice squad guy is that you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find enough men with the same level of skill to meet up with all these guys in the combine, and then of course they're going to get tired. And so as they get hit, you're going to want to get that guy in the later rounds. You're not going to want to hit him because he's not going to want to be embarrassed either.
Right.
So that first guy who comes up against him, he's going to want a deck because, he's on the practice squad and he doesn't want to get beat by an up and coming college snot.
Well, I mean, you make it known to them too that, our purpose here is not for you to look good. Our purpose here is to evaluate these guys. You need to play them each at this level.
As best you can.
Right.
So, when it comes to all of these, in the back of my mind, I still have this idea that the numbers themselves are not the point. That the numbers are a goal for the kid to meet.
Right.
And in attempting to meet that goal, you're hoping that they are going to play, practice, perform as hard as possible for that short length of time.
Okay. Yeah.
You collect a number because you have to, in order for them to compete at that level.
It's some sort of a benchmark to work with.
To beat each other. It keeps them honest.
Yeah.
If you just said, run as fast as you can, we're all watching.
Yeah.
Well, if there's nothing to beat, that number where I want to be the best in this combine, I want to be the best of all ever combines.
Right.
Well, then they're going to run as hard as they possibly can, especially knowing that there's another number at the other end of it.
Right.
Being in the first, 10 guys drafted.
Yeah, your contract.
Your contract.
How many millions am I going to make versus how many hundreds of thousands or whatever?
I often wonder, and not having talked to an NFL coach directly, how much the numbers themselves are important, and that how much the numbers are a goal for the kids to reach, and then it's really an eyeball test.
I would tend to agree. I would think it's a test of their self-discipline, their ability to train themselves, and I also think it tests for that clutch gene that some guys just have and some don't. Here's your moment. What are you going to do with it?
Right. I think there's a balance in terms of how much does that number mean to a particular coach, to a particular team, and it all depends upon what their priorities are. You've got a guy who just he didn't work out at the combine. He's regarded as a top 10 caliber prospect. He just had a pro day. University of Georgia linebacker / defensive end Jarvis Jones, and he had a very poor showing in his pro day. He ran like a 4.9 40, which for a linebacker is slow. And you've already got people talking about, did he hurt himself? Is he not a top 10 prospect anymore? I don't think anybody is thinking, well, I'm not going to take him in the first round. But now you've got those teams in the top 10, I'm sure, that are talking to themselves saying, yeah, he looks great on tape, on the game film, but do we want to sink millions of dollars into this kid if? And then it gets into, does he fit our scheme or not? It's hard to say, because going back to the first video that I did for Zone Blitz, I also talked about how everything is part of a process. And I think what happens too is that a lot of people tend to make a snap judgment based on a combine result or a pro day result. When the draft comes around, all of these teams are going to take a good long look at the overall body of work and balance everything out. I think it's a balancing act. It could be a matter of we've got this pick. There's 2 players on the board that we really like. Gee, it's really hard to make a decision between one or the other. This guy had a great combine. This guy didn't. That might be enough. If everything else is equal, that might be enough for the team to say, we'll go with this kid.
So I guess if you wanted to evaluate this for yourself without actually talking about the individual measurements done at the combine, might be to look at this. Again, as I understand it, you need to be invited to the combine.
Yep.
This is not Major League, where he
It's
shows
not
up.
a tryout. Yeah.
Well, they do have the regional.
It's not Wesley
they do have the
Snipes.
regional
Yeah.
that are open, that anybody can show up.
Yeah, the regional ones.
I think
Yep.
there's is there a fee or something that you can pay to?
I believe so. Yeah.
I don't think it's a lot. I think it was like I thought it was like $60 or something
Yeah.
like that.
So you're not showing up in your PJs like Wesley Snipes. And,
Right.
Yeah.
I'm running the guy at first base. So, what I was going to say is, what I think I would look at statistically is how many guys that either didn't make it to the combine at all, but made it to practice squads, eventually make it onto teams.
Right.
Because if you have a high number of people who never even get invited to the combine, and when I say high number, even if it's 10% of the NFL, work their way onto a team from a practice squad, never having made it to the combine, to me that is a huge knock on the efficacy of the combine.
Sure.
And those stats are out there.
Oh yeah.
So it shouldn't be too difficult to look up how many people who never made it to the combine one way or the other eventually have, when I say successful, a standard career. They make it, I think, the average length of time a guy plays NFL football is only 3.5 years.
About that.
So that would be how many guys make it past the practice squad and have a career of 3 years, 3 to 4 years or better that never went through the combine. If that number is relatively high, then you don't even need to discuss this. The combine isn't all that useful.
Okay.
If the number is really low, then the combine is doing its job.
Right. I think at the end of the day, certainly the number of players who get drafted have a far higher success rate than the number of players who walk on a team as an undrafted free agent. I don't know what to put it. Certainly you have, undrafted players who wind up, going on to have, great careers or whatever. Being an Atlanta Falcons fan, the guy that comes to mind for me immediately is Jesse Tuttle, middle linebacker who played for years and years and years, and he was a multi-time Pro Bowler. He'll probably never make the Hall of Fame, but he was a multi-time Pro Bowler.
Patriots fan, you can look at Wes Welker, who's an undrafted free agent.
Sure, but those are certainly exceptions to the rule.
But now you're talking about great players. I'm just asking how many make
the team and players. At least stick around to be
Probably
special teamers or something like that.
Probably
Sure.
And a lot of draft picks don't.
Right.
Yeah. How many Ryan Leafs do you wind up with? How many Tony Mandarins
Well, not
do you
even
wind
high
up
draft
with?
picks. There are a lot of, the 6th or 7th round draft pick basically has a 50-50 shot whether he's even going to make a game.
If that guy makes the team, you had a hell of a draft pick.
Yeah, I think that was
Tom Brady's or
I think that was Tom Brady, right?
Yep.
So I guess then what you're looking at is you've got kind of a statistical bell curve where you end up with the people on this end who never made it to the combine and make it on the team and are successful by the standards in the NFL. And the number of people who make it to the combine or are drafted, let's say, in the 3rd round or better, who don't make it 3 years.
Right.
Who are off of the team and out of the league before their average, which is 3.5 years, are up. And those numbers are on either side of this bell curve and everybody else is in the middle. I mean, what percentage of the NFL did those two ends make?
Yeah. I'll admit I haven't done that kind of study, so I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Interesting.
You mentioned something a second ago, and to me anyway, although I'm obviously not somebody who's very physically active, but to me it seems to be a relatively new term in the idea of exercise theory, exercise physiology, and that's this core training. I mean, I don't know how long the idea of the emphasis on building your core has been around. To me, it seems to be a relatively new concept, but that's something else that is measured here in this book when they talk about the ability for a player just overall to generate a lot of power, a lot of explosion. That's where that comes from, and so that's what should be developed. So core is referring to.
Well, core is the way it's defined today is really you're looking from your hips to basically through the middle rib cage. I mean, it really your torso. But when you see people talking about core exercises, you're talking about abdominals, obliques, extensors, glutes to some extent, lats to some extent.
Okay.
But we're talking the center of the body that allows you to rotate one way or the other. Okay. There's no better example of an athlete who uses core to its utmost. In fact, more than anything else, as a power hitter in baseball.
Okay,
You're talking about somebody the core is the focus, because you can't generate an enormous amount of energy from your arms. You can only generate so much energy from your legs. Yeah. But that spinning movement as you're directing the bat, the arms are really just putting the bat on the ball.
Okay.
The legs are keeping everything moving in the right direction. It's the core that gives you your distance.
Okay.
So in football, core is what keeps you from, being torn in half. It's think of it in 30 years ago, it was very, very popular, and maybe it still is. I've been out of football training for a little while. We do a lot of neck exercises. The guys used to fold a towel, put them on their forehead, and basically do a neck curl.
Yeah.
They made a machine, and you would do
all kinds of. I've got a friend of mine who played football in high school, and it was probably 30 or maybe even 40 years ago now that he played it. But he talked about and he swore by it. He swore that it saved his career, short-lived though it may have been, as a football player by doing those exercises, just sitting there and tilting your head and developing those.
Sure, collegiate wrestlers do it all the time because they're doing bridges and things to prevent injuries to the neck. So just move your neck down to your abs. You're still talking about spinal, the vertebrae. Right. You're talking about the muscles that stabilize those areas. So when a football player, gets hit, really gets chucked up under the rib cage, you're snapping back, and it's your core that's protecting your spine.
It becomes the shock absorber.
Right.
Okay.
When you're changing direction, and I know Tony's talked about this in the past, whether you're watching a person's head, shoulders, or hips, the movement between your shoulders and your hips is your core. So if your shoulders are aiming in one direction, your hips are going in the other direction, it's your core that is stabilizing them.
So in football, what that's really going to be important in is pass coverage for defenders. They have to know when to turn their hips around and go to a full sprint to keep up with the guy, or whether they want to keep their hips pointed towards the quarterback so they can read his eyes.
And so now you're talking about real meshing of training. Maybe inborn. I'm sure there are born receivers. People just know how to move.
Exactly.
How to juke and spin and
Barry
such.
Sanders.
Yep.
Right. And others who are able to learn it, and they're taught when to turn hips and when to lay a move down and do left or right. But when we're talking about core in training, we're talking about generally endurance rather than strength. Because muscles, all of them put together when used, again, recruitment patterns coming back, when all the muscles are recruited properly, they produce an enormous amount of energy, amount of power. They're not, individually, none of these muscles are particularly strong.
Okay.
And so, another aspect of this is throwing a baseball. And I'm going to bring up a name, and poor Johnny Damon is going to hate hearing it one more time. But Johnny Damon,
really bad arm.
Had a horrible arm.
Yeah.
But when people talked to the Red Sox players and asked them who were really the weight room addicts, the guys who were excellent, the strength trainers, he was one of the strongest men on the team by far. They all said he was one of the most dedicated, strongest guys, but he couldn't throw a ball, halfway across the outfield.
He was the guy teaching his son from that Super Bowl commercial.
I guess. Yeah. So one of my
sorry, Johnny, if you ever see this.
One of the guys that works with me at the high school was a collegiate level pitcher. Something to report. What we're saying is this gentleman was scouted by the pros as a pitcher. So I approached him and asked him, I said, why can't Johnny Damon throw a ball, to save his life? And he said, well, it all comes down to timing. he said that when he puts it all together to throw the ball, that half of the muscles that he's using to throw the ball have already completed their motion before the other half has. So to be explosive, all of the muscles that are going into the motion all have to be used timing-wise in the correct order at the correct time. He said it's very hard to teach that. He said so a guy who doesn't throw well will probably never throw well. You might take a guy who throws poorly and make him throw adequately, but you'll never take somebody who throws poorly and make them excellent. Because there's just this ingrained sense of timing between this. Basically what he said is Johnny Damon's legs are already placed before he starts moving his shoulder, and that your shoulder and arm has to be moving while your leg is coming forward, so that the entire body is moving as one unit, and that's what launches the ball. And that can be seen in pitchers. The average human can't move their hand faster than 60, 65 miles an hour, but obviously we can generate 97 mile an hour.
100 plus in some guys,
So, you're looking at your Josh Bard. Bard, anyway. So if you can't move your hand faster than 65, how can you accelerate a ball to 95? Well, if you were to do a slow motion assessment of a pitcher and you add up the velocity at every joint, rotational velocity, by the time you get to the fingertips, it'll be 95. And so if any one of those joints has stopped rotating before the ball is released, you subtract that from the equation. So it's all about timing. I'm sure it's the same in football. To really pop a guy coming out of a crouch, and you look at, I think, I'm not that knowledgeable, but things have changed, right?
It's a little bit. I would say it's about 50% timing and 50% just not caring what happens to your body.
Well, okay.
But it's funny, some of the things that you just mentioned in that comment was, reminded me. Well, one, it reminded me of. It makes me wonder if people aren't wasting their time trying to. Before we started rolling, you were talking about Tim Tebow, and one of the things that people rip on Tebow about is he's got a horrible throwing motion. And the idea that people keep trying to reteach him, like change your throwing motion, you'll be a better quarterback. Kerry Collins, when he came out of college all the way back in, I think it was 95, people were constantly ripping on him for having some sort of odd flip at the top of his motion. It would just look wrong, and like you'd be so much more efficient and everything if we could just coach this away from you. I don't think anybody's been able to change Tebow's motion. I don't think anybody ever got around to changing Kerry Collins. Phillip Rivers is often ripped on. He's got a very strong arm, but his throwing motion, he almost looks like he's shot putting the ball. But these guys have never been able to, as far as I know, unlearn. The other thing that it reminded me of, going back to baseball, though, was I remember flipping through a magazine article about trying to teach pitchers to change their body motion as they pitch, because so many, especially the young kids, the phenom there that the Nationals drafted, Strasburg, he's already like blown his arm out, once or twice?
They expected that.
And they look at the way the kid throws in college. Sooner or later, this is going to happen.
It's a very violent motion.
We need to change the way he throws so that he doesn't lose his skill, his talent, but also doesn't blow his arm out.
And in this case, you're talking about tweaking angles rather than timing. And they just did that with Bard. Bard last year fell apart. Really he could throw hard. He couldn't control that throw. Now, it's not to say that quarterbacks, don't have great control over a ball, but it is a different thing. Quarterback is trying to throw, the classic through a tire. So you're looking at an area of probably 2 to 3 feet, one direction or another. And you're also relying on having a good receiver who will make minor adjustments to speed up or slow down a little bit to get that ball to come where it goes. Even in a timing pattern, it's got to be that way. Where a baseball pitcher is literally, we're talking painting in inches. That they're moving this ball in such tiny increments and getting it to move in the air, getting it to curve, getting it to drop. Whereas a quarterback's major, as far as I can tell and watching them throw, is in angles. So how high to throw it, whether you're throwing it on a laser.
Touch, as they would call it in the NFL.
And, whether you're kind of lobbing it, it's a slower ball, it's going to throw off the defender, you're beaming it in there and maybe right through your receiver's hands because it's a little harder than they're used to seeing it. Baseball is a little bit different in that respect. But there have been men in baseball who have gone from an overhand pitch all the way down to a sidearm before they become successful.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to say that I think baseball shows that it can be done, but I'm not sure what the major difference is between the baseball training and the football throwing motion training. And maybe it's just that people have been watching baseball pitches to such the nth degree for so long. It'd be interesting. Could a baseball pitching coach come in and work, not with the quarterback, because I think that would screw everything up. Could he come in and work with the quarterback coaches and show them how to analyze arm angle and what's going on, and how to teach somebody to change their throw without screwing them up?
My theory on that is that a baseball pitcher, that is the only aspect of the game that he is responsible for. That's all he has to know how to do is throw the ball. You know, he might have a couple of different pitches that are useful for different hitters or different situations, but that's all he needs to know how to do. A quarterback needs to know how to throw the ball. He needs to know how to read a defense. Mm-hmm. He needs to know the receiver's route tree.
Yeah. I certainly was trying to compare it. The difficulty.
I'm not physical. Not necessarily even the difficulty. It's just that he has more that he's responsible for. Baseball pitchers are absolute specialists.
Right.
You know, they have one thing that they are supremely good at. Mm-hmm. Quarterback has to be good at a couple more. He has to be very versatile.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think probably
football players all around tend to be generalists. Who tend to be good at a lot of things.
In my opinion, is probably the most skilled position in sports. And the hardest thing to do in sports, I believe, is to hit a baseball. Most people say. But I still think overall the most skilled athletic position in sports, because of the combination of physical and mental skills, is being a passing quarterback.